About 5 years ago, I was getting divorced. How's that for an intro to a sermon? It's true. It's really sad, but true. That happened. Certainly was never the plan, but we both kind of got to that place. And I don't think I'm making this up. I think I had the easiest divorce in the history of divorces. We didn't have any assets at all, so there wasn't anything of the complex stuff there. We didn't have kids. We both kind of generally at the same time realized, gosh, this is really hard. There was some stuff there that we both realized, and this is going to sound odd to a lot of us because we don't think that way, but the loving thing to do for each other was to let go. And that's a hard thing, and I'm certainly not promoting that for in general for marriages. That was just where we were. And so, as you can imagine, look, it was a very easy divorce in all the ways I just outlined, but it's also a divorce, so it was really hard, right? It's still just hard. And so we were in Northern California. She decided to move to Southern California. I was trying to grow in my career, and I got a job in San Francisco. And so decided to kind of take that step, and I was 37, and I got a roommate, because it's San Francisco, and it's super expensive, and just kind of did that part of the adventure. So if anybody's ever been divorced, you're still adulting. Like, you have all the stuff you're still going through, right? You have to go to work in the morning. You're super sad, and you're grieving, but you have to be an adult, and if you have kids, you're dealing with all of that, and it can be super messy. And even though I didn't have kids, it was a new job, it was a stretch for me, and I was underneath it all and probably not even able to admit it to myself, really sad. And so you're just kind of pressing on. And I remember one particular week, it was probably 6 or 7 months into the job, I was in a meeting. It wasn't a particularly tense meeting, it was just a meeting. And I had made a couple friends with some of my colleagues, and one of them was sitting across from the table, and I was sitting there with a hot cup of coffee at like 10 in the morning, and I had this incredible urge to throw this hot cup of coffee at the person across the table. And you laugh, and it's funny to hear about, but it freaked me out. Because what would happen? Like, that'd be terrible. This was actually a friend of mine as well. And so I'm not lying to you. I'm not embellishing for the sake of a story. I'm like, in my brain, like, dude, what are you doing? And you should probably hold your arm. Like, so I take my other arm and just, like, calm on the surface, like, rest it here. And I literally had a really powerful urge to do that. So I mentally talked myself down, and it was like a Thursday or something. I go back into my office, and I had to reset. I'm like, what is happening? And I realized there were several times that week I had felt the urge to do something rash that would create this gigantic reaction, and probably I was trying to blow my life up because I was sad and I didn't know how to deal with it, right? So I'm like, wow, that is freaking me out. Well, I happened to be going to therapy, thank goodness. As I was trying to kind of work through stuff, I would go every other week or so. And so at the next session, I really wasn't connecting all the dots with like why this was happening. But we were talking about something, and I don't even remember how we got there, but the therapist was like, you know, Matt, I don't think you like have done the anger part of this yet. And I'm like, oh, okay, what, you know, and she's like, I think you go to like other emotions first, but you haven't really done like the anger thing. And I'm like, yeah, I guess that's true. You know, maybe when I'm competitive at sports or showing road rage, maybe I'll be a little angry, but in my interpersonal relationships, I don't go there. It's like the last thing that I go to from an emotion standpoint. And I said, oh, wait, the funniest thing happened last week. And really casual, like, it's no big deal. And so I tell her, and she was an attentive therapist, but the moment I told the coffee story, she like sat up on the edge of her seat and was like, oh, let's talk about that. I'm like, that's the not-so-subtle therapist way of saying, we really need to dig into this. And I realized, wow, like, I have some stuff going on there that I don't know how to deal with, and I need to grow through this in a way that I didn't even know I needed to. So I'll come back to that story a little bit, but we are in part 2 of a new sermon series called The Kingdom of God is Like. Last week was Pastor Tom, or PT, who talked about the parable of the mustard seed. You might have seen the whiteboard as you come into the sanctuary. Had some notes from last week's sermon, and just talked about that parable of the mustard seed, and what that faith is like, and what it can accomplish, and really how much it amazes Jesus. So we're in part 2 today, And we're using this, the kingdom of God is like, because that's a common phrase in the Gospels with the parables. Jesus will say, the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven is like. All right? So today we're going to focus on the parable of the sower, S-O-W-E-R, to avoid any confusion. The parable of the sower. I invite you to turn to Matthew chapter 13. And your smartphones, your Bibles, I will put the words on the screen, but it's good to have the Bible open sometimes just to kind of go where your thoughts take you. Matthew chapter 13. That same day, and I'm going to read the big stretch of passage here. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places, where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow, but when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among the thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop, 160 or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let them hear. Then there's a stretch in the next few verses where the disciples ask, why do you tell us this in parables? Like, this is confusing. What's the point? Jesus gives them a mini sermon on why he does that, and then he comes to verse 18 where he starts to explain the parable. Listen then to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. This is the seed sown along the path. The seed falling on rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word and at once receives it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. The seed falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, making it unfruitful. But the seed falling on good soil refers to someone who hears the word and understands it. This is the one who produces a crop, yielding 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. So that's a lot. I'm not going to lie, I don't think this was Jesus' point, but I love the way he approaches the last line of explaining it. He starts out by saying, he's basically saying, the faithful person will produce a crop, and he starts with 100-fold. And I imagine he looks around and looks at Peter and is like, 60-fold. And he sees Judas, and he's coming his way down to 30. And I'm imagining he's surveying the territory. And I'm grateful because hopefully by implication he's coming down to 20 and 10 and 5, and hopefully I have a chance. So selfishly, that's what I hope Jesus meant, although I'm sure he didn't. What we're going to focus on today, we could spend a whole sermon series on the 4 different scenarios, right? You could spend a long time digesting what this means. But we're going to focus on the last one, the last scenario there in the parable, because that's what Jesus is driving at, right? He lays out all 4, and the first 3 we can understand aren't ideal, and then the 4th is obviously what Jesus is hoping for, right? For us to follow him, for his disciples to follow him and produce a crop, right? 160 or 30-fold. So a question we're going to explore a little bit is, what does it mean in our lives to yield a crop, 160 or 30-fold? What does that mean? What does Jesus mean by that? So let's be clear. The basics of the parable or the story are, the farmer is Jesus, okay? And then the seed is his word, or really probably his words and actions, right? His life, that's what he means by sowing the seed, the farmer sowing the seed. And then what he's hoping out of this is that the listeners will hear it, will understand it, and by understand it means want it, right? And out of that, there'll be a crop produced in our lives. That's the basics of the story. Okay, so I was thinking if we're going to answer the question, what does that look like for a person to yield a crop, 160, 30-fold? I feel like at a simple level, it comes back to us having to know who Jesus is, right? So we could walk through every single verse. That would take too much time. I think the point Jesus is trying to make is that looks like you following me. And so for us now, we really have to understand who Jesus is. Who are the people he spent time with? What are the things that he said? What was he trying to accomplish? What were the characteristics and virtues in his life that he was trying to teach his disciples and us? But if I could presume, I plucked a couple of the themes of his life out. It would be things like taking care of the sick, spending time with lepers, or maybe for us in our context, those on the margins. We all know we need to do that. That's uncomfortable. He rebuked arrogance and spiritual abuse. He said things like, turn the other cheek, and blessed are the poor in spirit. Things that are not easy to do. He told us to love our enemies. He lived a life of service. These would be the list goes on and on and on. These are the kinds of things that Jesus did and said in his life, right? I think it's safe to say when Jesus is in the parable saying, I hope that a listener, an observer of my life, bears a crop that's 160 or 30-fold, it would be to be like Jesus. Simple, I know. If you've grown up in church, you've heard that a lot. Let's go to another mention of this parable. There's actually, this parable is mentioned in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke. In Luke 8:14, so this we're not going to read the whole thing here, obviously, but this is Luke's telling, and this is Jesus talking. So Jesus is explaining the parable in Luke 8, and he says, the seed that fell among thorns stands for those who hear, but as they go on their way, they are choked by life's worries, riches, and pleasures, and they do not, what? They don't mature. And I love that because it's easier for me to connect to the concept of growing, becoming more mature spiritually than an agricultural metaphor. He's talking about the spiritual journey. He's talking about that if we spend time with Jesus, we'll grow. It's a process of spiritual maturity. I love how that connects back and adds some color to the parable we read in Matthew 13. So a couple threads, or one thread I guess I wanted to mention when we talk about spiritual journey, spiritual growth. I think we have to be careful not to view things in too short of a time frame sometimes when we talk about our spiritual growth. It's easy to do that. We can look at other people, we can look at ourselves, we can judge ourselves, we can be critical of other people. Sometimes there's a whole lot happening inside, and we can't really see everything on the surface. I think we have to be careful sometimes to understand that the spiritual maturation is an up and down journey, right? We can't over-presume. Sometimes these things take time. We can't look at it too short of a time frame. I do think probably most of us, when we talk about the spiritual journey, it's pretty easy, actually. There's some traditional ways that you would look at someone's life and say, oh, that person is growing, right? It's on the surface. You see it. Like someone is you can sense the passion in their life that maybe seems like they're getting closer to God. They become more generous. They become more kind. They start to spend more time in their free time with mission or outreach or various things. Manage their anger, like not throwing coffee at someone in a meeting. Like you can observe things, and those are kind of obvious. They speak for themselves. You can tell someone is growing, and don't let my short list confine us. All kinds of ways we would look at someone's life and say, gosh, that person is growing. You can tell. But what about, is it possible that spiritual maturation can be taking place for a person who's clinging to faith despite doubts in every part of what they believe? Is it possible for someone to be growing spiritually while experiencing that? What about someone who's disregarding beliefs that they grew up with? Is it because they just don't believe it anymore? Is it possible? Or can we feel okay about that actually could be spiritual growth for someone? Maybe it's uncomfortable to think about. Is it possible that someone could be maturing spiritually by leaving the community they were born into, the spiritual community they were born into? I think so. Not always, but sometimes. Are we comfortable enough saying that God is ultimately in control and leading people in ways that we don't always fully understand? And sometimes they make decisions we don't get. And sometimes that's actually spiritual growth. What about a person who was raised in a really abusive spiritual environment and they have to get out? That can be spiritual growth. And hopefully they find their way back into a safe spiritual community. The spiritual journey is at once simple, because we can see it in the ways that we all understand we can see it, and also super complicated, and we can't see all of it. So honest moment, I guess honest question, you don't have to yell it out, but be honest with yourselves. When you go through the scenarios in the parable of the sower, it's 4 of them, right? How many of you, when you read the first 3, tend to think of someone else that you know that experienced that in their lives? Right? So the first one, the seed is sown and it lands on the path, and actually it's kind of a freaky, if you overinterpret it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. If you completely took that literally, that would be like saying that a person heard about what Jesus was saying and didn't even have a chance to respond because the devil didn't give him a chance. Like, that's freaky. By the way, it's a parable. We have to be wise and not over-literalize every part of a parable. But is your natural instinct when you read this parable to think about someone else who it seems like that happened in their life? And then we get to the second one. There's a tiny bit of root, there's an initial reaction, and then quickly the person falls away. And you think about someone else, right? Because that happens to people that we see in our lives. Or the third one, when it actually seems like it takes root and there's growth, over time, complicating things in life, maybe it kind of chokes out or chokes some of that growth with all the things that we can think about that can do that in life, and you naturally think of your family member or your friend or that person at school or whatever. And then magically, you get to the 4th scenario and you think about your own journey because it's personal to you and you know that you're responding to God. And maybe it's not 100-fold crop, but maybe it's 30. We think about other people with the first 3 and magically flip the switch and think about ourselves with the 4th one. Does anybody do that? Did you find yourself doing that? It's just me. I totally do that. I read the first 3 because I view myself as being in a relationship with God. And so I read the first 3 and I think about somebody else that happened to. It's kind of weird, right? I was thinking about the way this parable works. I always was assumed, and maybe it is the right interpretation, that when Jesus outlined the 4 scenarios with how we respond, that it's kind of 4 general, very distinct and general ways that people respond to him, right? So in general, there's a group of people that say, I just don't want anything to do with that. I don't believe it, don't want anything to do with that. That would be one, right? There's a second distinct group that says, that's kind of exciting, and then quickly, for whatever reason, they don't really keep growing, and the third, and so forth. 4 very distinct ways to respond to God. That's probably what Jesus meant. I don't know, I'm assuming. I started thinking, could it also mean the ways that we react in the different parts of our life with the different things in each of those buckets? Like, I can think of my own life, moments where I think I probably felt like there was a way God was trying to lead me, and it didn't take at all. Bucket number 1. And at the very same moment, another place in my life that I maybe thought God was leading me, and I really responded well. Scenario 4 in the parable. I wonder if we can look at our own lives and identify ways where we have responded in each of those different scenarios, rather than treat them as 4 distinct groups. When are the moments in your life where you could look back and say, I'm not going there, God. I'm not doing that. Or, it was exciting for a while, and then, But also we could still be in scenario 4, where generally we're maturing with God. A different way to think about it. I want to invite the praise team to come up as we kind of wind down. I think the question I want to leave us with is, what about you? Rather than if you did, and it wasn't just me, assume you kind of think of other people with the first 3 scenarios. Reflect on your life. What are those moments? Maybe it's now. Maybe there's some stuff that you're like, I really do actually think God's trying to lead me to a different place with something. But you might be reacting in any one of those 4 different ways. What are those for you? At its most fundamental level, this parable is the farmer, Jesus, sowing his seed, demonstrating his words and actions for us, and inviting us to respond. He is inviting us. That's why Matthew and Luke and Mark wrote it down, and it's preserved for 2,000 years. The point of this is for us to ask ourselves in response, God, where are you leading me next? Where do I need to grow? What is it for you? So something odd happened to me as I was listening to the music and standing there during the first part of the service. So I used to be a pastor. So I've done a lot of sermons. I'm a really structured prep person. I don't just wing stuff. So I spend time on stuff. And so as I was standing over there listening to music, I had this weird, I spent time prepping for this. So I was standing there, I had this weird thought oh, something is missing in my sermon. That's a freaky thought before you go up and speak it. What? I don't know. Something does not feel right about this. Something is missing. And then the team played the song, You're Beautiful. And I realized that sometimes a part of this spiritual journey concept that I fight is I feel like I'm supposed to grow. You should grow. And if you've been raised in a Christian environment or perhaps other Christian environments, despite many good, well-intentioned efforts by your parents and your friends and your pastors and your whoever, sometimes we end up with a you should. And I don't like that. And so I'm sitting there thinking something is missing. And I think it's because I get hung up personally on the you should be growing versus if you're in a relationship with Jesus, you just will. Just will. And if we can spend time with God and see his beauty, how do we all respond to beauty in our lives? We're drawn to it. It shapes us. And the people that we are in relationship to shape us. So please don't, in my opinion, misunderstand the parable of the sower and this 100-fold, 60-fold, 30-fold as a should. You just will. Just spend some time with God. Be in his presence. Appreciate his beauty. You will grow. So, after saying that and feeling a lot better about my sermon, at least for me, what is he leading you into next? To be more generous, to be more kind, to set boundaries in your life and so you can prioritize your family? Less time on Facebook? I'm revealing my age, Facebook, whatever the newest, popular social media thing is. To break that addiction, finally, to have that extra ounce of gumption or whatever you call it to seek help. To work through your emotions and your anger as you're navigating a difficult time in your life so you don't throw hot coffee on people. What is it for you? A.W. Tozer writes, "We need never shout across the spaces to an absent God. He is nearer than our own soul, closer than our most secret thoughts." I'm going to read that again. We need never shout across the spaces to an absent God. He is nearer than our own soul and closer than our most secret thoughts. And I included that because I believe that if you spend time with God, and whether it's verbal or just a posture of asking and listening, you will find that he'll give you an answer. That's the invitation. So I invite you this week, this month, spend a little extra time, ask, God, what do you have for me next? How do you want me to grow?